Hello, my name is Julie Chavinsky. I'm the director of the Blavatnik Archive, and I thank you for joining us today in our virtual workshop, Blavatnik Archive Collections in the Classroom. We digitize, catalog, and when possible, produce transcripts and translations for our collections to maximize access to our holdings. We work with scholars to interpret and contextualize our collections to enhance historical knowledge and contribute diverse perspectives to narratives. In addition, we collaborate with professors and teachers across the United States to encourage the use of our digital primary source in education. In this workshop, I'm excited and grateful to introduce 4 presenters who have worked with us with our collections in their own research and who will discuss their experiences of using digital primary sources in their courses, including general strategies, specific assignments, and student feedback. In order of their appearance, the speakers are Samuel Coggeshall, visiting assistant professor of Russian and Soviet history in the Department of History at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Stephen Norris, director of the Havighurst Center at Miami University in Ohio. Brandon Schechter, Blavatnik Archives historian and visiting professor of history at Sarah Lawrence College. And Marina Aptekman, associate professor, teaching professor in Department of International Library and Cultural Studies at Tufts University. And now our first speaker, Professor Coggeshall.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to the archive for having me onto this program to talk about how I use some of the Blavatnik Archive collections in my teaching. So I'm Sam Coggeshall. I teach as visiting assistant professor of Russian and Soviet history at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. My work is on the formation of independent national states and Soviet republics during the Russian Civil War. But today I'm going to be talking about how I use Blavatnik archive materials in lecture courses on modern European history and on modern Russian and Soviet history. Let me just share my screen so that I can show you some of the slides. Is everyone seeing that now? Does everyone see that? Okay,
Yep, we
great.
see your screen and the
Excellent.
slide.
Fantastic. So at UNCW, I teach 13 different courses on a range of subjects. It's a lot of courses, but you can take that up with my superiors. But today, I'm just going to be talking about 2 of those courses, History 326, Modern Russia since 1881, and History 102, which is the second half of European History Survey, Modern European History. So in those courses, which are introductory survey lecture courses with approximately 30 students, I use Blavatnik archive materials both in the course design and course content and in assignments for those courses. Assignments in these courses are meant to introduce students to writing a brief historical essay, but I think more importantly to the practice of historical thinking and to the use of sources, to the use of historical and archival materials as sources. So first I'll talk about how I use these collections, some of these collections in my course content. So in my Modern Russia and History Survey course, I use the materials from the veterans' testimonies, the Soviet Jewish veterans' testimonies and ephemera collection in the course content. Now, the Blavatnik Archive is really an amazing resource for this. I also use Blavatnik Archive images in my slides and things, but here I'm just going to be talking about how I use some of the veterans' testimonies in teaching aspects of the Second World War. So in the second lecture that I give on the Second World War, I begin to talk about the Soviet advance after 1943. And these are just examples of how I use these testimonies. So, for example, In talking about the Battle of Kursk, I described the Battle of Kursk and its context, and then I switched to this clip from this veteran Vladimir Barkon's testimony, where this individual describes the experience of the Battle of Kursk in great detail and in quite frightening detail. So I use these sources, the veterans' testimonies, to talk about the Second World War, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Holocaust, the Soviet advance after 1943, and the Soviet liberation of Nazi-occupied territory and of Eastern Europe, all of which are interrelated and which all are served by the materials that are held in the collection of interviews and veterans' testimonies. So after this sort of clip, for example, then I begin to talk about the other aspects of the Soviet advance. Then I use this clip from Stanislav Severinovsky of talking about the possibility, this is a great one. I don't know if many of you have seen this clip. In this clip, this veteran talks about coming upon a dairy factory in formerly occupied territory, and finding that the soldiers find this dairy factory with vats filled with smetana, with sour cream, and they are really excited about that. They start to taste it. They've been told that everything has been poisoned. They're worried about it being poisoned. They taste it carefully. They're okay. And then they eventually consume all of these vats of sour cream. And it's kind of a really good example of using these materials to talk about the dangers of the Soviet advance, about personal experiences, and also to introduce humor alongside the tragedy of these events. And I also use these materials to talk about the Holocaust. So, for example, in my lectures on the Holocaust, I use this veteran's testimony about the execution of Jewish communities in the Caucasus by Nazi forces of occupation. So these are in my modern Russian history class. I also use these materials in my modern Europe survey, again, to talk about the Second World War, to talk, for example, here about the initial invasion of the Soviet Union, the encirclement of Soviet troops, the experience of retreat, and so on. And again, after introducing the context, the historical material, then I play these clips, which allow the students to have access to sort of the individual experiences of these veterans. Again, I talk about the Battle of Kursk with the veterans' testimonies, about advancing into liberated territory, again, about the Holocaust. So Severinovsky also discusses in his testimony the experience of liberating and discovering Treblinka, and the experience of finding local populations engaged in digging through the fields around Treblinka to attempt to find valuables from within the ashes there. So now I want to talk a little bit about how I use these materials in course assignments. So crucially, I show these video clips that I was just showing you in my lecture slides after the assignment that I'm about to describe to you has gone out. So I am able to use these sources to show how, in my lectures, to show how the sources can be used in the assignment that I give. So here's just a brief version of the assignment. I'm going to show you the full assignment, but basically in both my Modern Europe survey and in my course on Modern Russian history, I have an assignment based on the collection of veterans' testimonies. And the students don't see this assignment until it goes live. So it's a surprise to them. Basically, the assignment asks them to select a veteran from the veterans that are included in the Veterans Testimonies collection, and write an essay about their experience of the Second World War. They have to select a veteran, which means that they have to watch a number of videos in order to determine which veteran they'd like to write about. I limit this selection to I'm sorry, I keep clicking that. I limit this selection to the interviews with veterans that were recorded in Russia. That's simply an artificial limitation that I use in order to, because there are hundreds of veterans' testimonies, by limiting it to those recorded in Russia, which I can do with the online interface of the archive, I can limit the number of possible veterans that students can choose to around 30 to 40. So this, it at least narrows it down a little bit, but they still have to watch these videos and choose a veteran to write about. So now I'll share, if I can, the full assignment. Yes, so this is the full assignment. It's the same idea, right? They are meant to select a veteran and then write an essay about their experience of the Second World War on the basis of both their testimony and materials that are connected to that veteran within the archive that are held as well. And I asked them to sort of describe what this veteran's experience of the Second World War was, what it represents, what it tells us about the war, what it tells us about the Soviet experience of the war and Soviet history. And again, I use this both in my Modern Europe survey lecture course and in my Modern Russia lecture course. Now, another collection that I use from the Blavatnik Archive in my teaching and in my assignments is the World War I Postcards and Ephemera collection. So I'm just going to share another window here with another assignment. I can find it, sorry. Here we are. Which is the assignment for my Modern Europe survey course, which asks students to look through a selection of postcards from the Blavatnik's World War I Postcards and Ephemera collection and write an essay about what those postcards from just before the war or during the war show about the military cultures of Europe in the lead up to the First World War. So I give them a selection, in this case, of 10 postcard images that they can choose one to write about. I include the Blavatnik Archive records, but just as background for them to begin to write about them. This gives them a range of options to write about the nationalism that's represented in these images, the esprit de corps, the camaraderie that we see among these troops, the sort of attitude towards violence that we see in some of these postcards, the presence of both new technologies and more intensively used older technologies like the horse that we see in these postcards, the organization of life in a military barracks, and so on. So there's a range of options that they can write about through this assignment. But both of these assignments also involve limits on what they can use. And that's, just to sort of wrap up here, that's another real virtue, I think, of using these collections in my teaching and in my assignments. And I'm sure there are different views, people have different views on AI here, but when assigning a writing assignment, an essay in an introductory survey course, I think that the goal is for them to practice the operations of analyzing a source, gathering evidence, forming an argument, and writing out that argument. And AI, I don't think, can be involved in that. So these assignments offer a way not only of introducing them to these sources, to introducing them to these experiences, but also of limiting the possibility of AI use. At the very least, they have to go through these materials. They have to watch some of the veterans' testimonies. They have to engage with them. They have to read these postcards to begin to make an argument about them. So these assignments limit what they can do, but also give them a range of options to write about their analysis of these archival sources. And lastly, I'll just say that the responses I've gotten, I should have gathered them for this. I haven't gathered them up really, but students have really, really liked these assignments, and especially the assignment on the veterans' testimonies. They've indicated in their comments when submitting the papers, in class after these assignments have gone out, and in student evaluations, that these assignments were really a highlight of the course, that they loved engaging with these veterans' histories, that they totally transformed their understanding of the Second World War, of the Soviet experience, and so on. So these are really popular. I think they work very well, and I'm really interested to hear what everyone else has to say about teaching using these collections, about assignments, and thoughts on using these collections. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Sam. Really, really interesting and really appreciate it. If it's okay with everyone, we'll save sort of the comments and questions to the end after everyone has had a chance to present, especially as these are sort of diverse classes and uses. So maybe once we hear everybody's presentations, it'll be best to do it afterwards. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Steve, if you wouldn't mind going next, presenting.
Yep, happy to be here. Thanks for everyone for coming. Sam, you just reminded me that I need to embed these videos, I think, more in my class. And also, as you know or may remember, if you really do need someone to speak to the authorities about your teaching load, Taylor Fain is my friend from grad school, your department chair. So, I have some compliment if you need it on William Taylor Fain III. So I have a PowerPoint up here. Julie and Brandon have heard some of this before, actually most of this from the ACs, but it is devoted to the way I have used the Blavatnik Archive collections in my class. I have 3 ideas for assignments, one of which I've used extensively, and I'll focus most on that. And if that's all I get to, that's fine. I can talk about the other 2 in Q&A. And I call it Experiencing the Past. And this is for a course I teach on the World Wars. It's a 200-level history course. It's a general ed course. Miami Plan is what we call it here. It is enrolled anywhere from 50 to 100 students, depending on what my department chair needs me to do. I've had a grader with it, but mostly the last time I've just taught it myself. So it's your typical student who isn't a history student, and a subject that they have chosen to meet a history requirement here at Miami on the World Wars. And one of the assignments I do, I try to focus on some low stakes assignments so that they can earn points. This is kind of what freshmen and sophomores want, but also to stress some skills that are inherent to history and historical study, much like Sam was just talking about. So I have them do 2 to 4 presentations per semester. That depends on the number of students in the class. They do at least one on the era of the First World War and one on the era of the Second World War, sometimes 2 on each. So this is the assignment as it's written in my syllabus. The class itself is structured around, as you can see here, historical experiences and stories. So one of the things I try to do in the class is balance the big picture narrative of what exactly happened in July, August 1914 or June 1941 with, say, stories of people who lived through these periods. And one of the ways I use stories is to have a series of links in the syllabus to individuals, and those stories are always connected to primary sources. The Imperial War Museum in London has some tremendous online resources that often functions as the experience for students in the first half of the class. The Blavatnik Archive provides the bulk of some of the experiences for a couple days in the second half of the class once we get to World War II. The World War I postcards are also an option too. So students are asked each class period to come to class having at least looked at and clicked on one of these options. Choose an experience that they think is most interesting to them. Sometimes the size of the class means they don't do it, but the bulk of the students do at least come having read one of them. And then every class period, at least 4 or so members of the class have an assignment to click on one of these links, read it, and prepare a 3-minute PowerPoint presentation that they give in front of class. I can talk about AI proofing it as well. I also think this would work in my Soviet history class. I haven't had the opportunity to use it yet in Soviet history, but doing presentations using something like the Blavatnik Archive and maybe using those veteran testimonies would work pretty well. So here you can see you have the 3-minute presentation. Here is a snippet on the screen of an actual day from the class where I focus on the Siege of Leningrad. And there are the options for students to click on for the experience. And there are the 4 students who chose options. They send an email to me, and then I update the syllabus. We try not to have overlap so we don't have 2 students presenting on the same topic, although that's frankly not that big of a problem if they do, because they always have something different to say. Here is the appendix that has the rubric of how they're graded. That's a 5.1. And here's what I try to stress, as you can see on the bottom. This helps them with public speaking skills, that asks them to be able to look at some information, sift through it, and then summarize it to a broad audience. Some of the members of the class have read the same article. Most of them have not. So it really is up to the individual student to explain why this was significant. And it puts a focus on primary sources and how you interpret them, which is, of course, at the heart of the historical enterprise. Here is a list of the Blavatnik Archive stories that I use in this History of the World Wars class. They appear at different points in the semester. As you can see, most of them have to do with the World War II part of the World Wars class, but not all of them. Some of them are written by Brandon Schechter. And then here are some examples of what students did this last semester. I used it in the spring. I taught this course. It went really well. Just as Sam experienced too in the course evaluation, students really liked doing this. It got them to learn about things they hadn't really thought about before. It helped focus their attention on something other than just the big picture stuff. So here's John from my class in the spring, clicked on that Boris Kudyarov's Leningrad photos. And here is the actual PowerPoint he put together. By the way, I'm using the PowerPoint template that I used for the class and that the students then use too. It also has this little technology bit built into the class. So here's what he summarized for his classmates, and then he worked them through these points, spoke for exactly 3 minutes, talked about the big picture here, talked about Kudyarov's photos and what they are, who he was, showed a couple examples. I always ask, as if you read in the fine print of the assignment, you ought to select 2 or 3 primary sources that you focus on the most and explain why those were most significant to you, what they help explain about the larger story or the larger collection of primary sources, and how it spoke to you personally. So here's what John chose. A couple of the photographs here. And then most of the good students, John was one of them, have a final slide like this. And once you see the first presentation, most adopted, of some big picture takeaways. This is what he concluded, having looked at this story. And of course, gave the Blavatnik Archive full credit here too, which is nice. The students in this class now seem to know about the Blavatnik Archive. You saw in that snippet from my syllabus, there were 4 students on this day of the Siege of Leningrad. John was one of them. Avery was another. She actually chose probably the hardest topic of all, which was just a link to the Blavatnik's Siege of Leningrad postcards, all 1,300 of them, or however many there are digitized. So she sifted through a few of them and made her own presentation. Here's how she concluded. She did quite a nice job. I didn't provide any further details. She found out that there was a lot of information. Here's what she had to say about the Blavatnik's collection of the Siege of Leningrad postcards to people in the class. And then here are the 3 postcards that she found most striking and talked about in class. 4 postcards, one of which was sent, as you can see. This is third example from Andrew, is based on Brandon's article and story that he wrote for the Blavatnik site on censorship and readership in the Red Army. Here's one of my students, his presentation that same day. So you can imagine this one class period, I talked about the Siege of Leningrad, what happened, the dates, all these specifics, mentioned people like Shostakovich, Olga Bergholz, and other names. And then at various points throughout the class to break up the class time, these students presented what you see here on the screen. So this was Andrew's presentation using Brandon's article, where he also honed in on some of the primary sources Brandon did. Brandon modeled good historical work for Andrew and my students. And Andrew did a great job. He talked a lot about the censorship nature and had my students then, by extension, look at the way censorship stamps worked, walked us through some examples of Soviet censorship that Brandon did in his article, reached similar conclusions as Brandon, and summarized things quite well. This is from a previous class. So those three examples were from the class I just taught this past spring. Here's from a couple years ago when I taught it, just to, again, focus on one of the collections the Blavatnik Archive has, and another story of the family letters from one family. I thought this student did a particularly good job in terms of how she summarized this story, used the information, and presented it to her fellow students, all within 3 minutes. She even highlighted the primary sources from that story, and then really gave some eloquent conclusions. So that's part one. That's the primary way I use the Blavatnik Archive in the classroom. And as I said, I think presenting in front of class has lots of advantages. The AI proofing here is that at some point you do have to stand in front of your fellow students with notes in your hand or not, and speak to them in 3 minutes and seem authoritative. In the future, just to also kind of think further about and react to the advent of AI and ChatGPT, because of course it's theoretically possible that a student could just plug in a link to Brandon's story on censorship and readership and say, produce 3 PowerPoints and get it. Then they would be forced to stand in front of class and talk about something they maybe didn't look at. But I also, at various points in the class, and will now make it part of the assignment, have follow-up questions to students asked by me or by students in the class who have also read that experience. And that, I think, will further prevent students from relying on AI exclusively, knowing that they might get graded on a question. What was the postcard that you cut in the last minute? The 2 other postcards that you looked at that you didn't include in this PowerPoint might be a way of preventing that. That said, it wasn't a problem, I don't think, this past spring. I was pretty upfront about AI usage and my feelings about it and the reasons why you should click on these links and kind of spend some time with some people who have lived through the siege of Leningrad. I'm at my 10 minutes, so I'll just kind of briefly talk about these other 2 options. The other one is called Writing the Past, a creative option. I have started to introduce creative options, partly because I'm interested in what students do, partly because students seem to like it, and I get different students with different skills. And also, again, a kind of reaction to AI, like it's harder to be creative, I think, about something. But also the richness of the Blavatnik collection, as I've used it for another project I'm working on with Julie and Brandon, is in the postcards that were used, and to think about the way in which people used postcards, bought them, wrote to loved ones for information. So here's an example that I've used at a essay I've written for the archive. And then here's the assignment: write the response. And as you can see here, you're then selecting another postcard that you would send back. You also should read the Censorship and Readership in the Red Army article by Brandon to kind of figure out what would go in and what wouldn't, and then think further about that first postcard when the father wrote to the son. So now you're the son writing back to the father. Or a postcard I just wrote about recently, this ball game one, which is a revealing one that does show some of the effects of the siege, but probably as much as you could possibly show on a postcard that went through censorship in Leningrad, but one where the author of the postcard, the person who bought it and sent it, said everything on the front is true. So the assignment here would also be to read Brandon's article, try to figure out what the person who wrote "this is all true" is referring to, having learned a little bit more about the siege and what people lived through. I'll skip through that. The last thing I'll say is to, in a sense, do what Brandon and others did, what I have done for the Blavatnik Archive, and that is curate your own postcard collection. There are 1,300 postcards in the siege collection. There is, as Sam referenced, a large collection of World War I postcards. So to kind of give students, this would be a more advanced assignment, a link to all of these postcards as they've been uploaded on the site, and then ask them to curate their own collection, pick 20 or 25 or so that speak to a certain theme, and then create their own version of a story that might eventually go up on the Blavatnik's site. All right, thanks everyone. I will stop there. Thanks for listening. Happy to answer questions, and I'll turn things back over to Julie.
Thank you, Steve. Fascinating. I just want to sign up for these classes and wish I had them. I'm very jealous and upset. I'm jealous of the students that you have. Yeah, I look forward to actually also asking some questions later. But not to waste time now, Brandon, if you wouldn't mind taking over.
Sure, thanks. Let me start off by saying, Steve, it's incredibly gratifying to know that stuff is being used in the classroom. That's just always wonderful to know. And I am going to start off with, long before I became the historian of the Blavatnik Archive, I was using our stuff in the classroom. And one of the more extensive uses of that was a class that I taught during the ill-fated spring semester of 2020 with my friend and colleague Ann Lounsbury at NYU, which is a class, Genres of War in Russia. And basically that was set up, it was an MA level course. A shocking number of students from that course are now PhD students, oddly enough. And each week was kind of set up around a genre of understanding war, whether it was, we started off with Lieutenantskaya proza. We moved into, reading Con Armia alongside Babel's actual diary of a Civil War experience. And the week that I want to draw our attention to was the week War as Personal, where we use the diary and interview of Boris Klumsky, one of my favorite things that we have, something that I have used very extensively in my first book and I'm using in my current book. And what we have here is we have his diary that's contemporary from 1943 to 1945, alongside an interview that was taken in 2009. And basically each week in this course, there was usually, this week's actually exception, there was usually a work of fiction, a work of memoir, and some theoretical works. And so the theoretical works, here we have no fiction, here we have just this person at various junctures in their life. And the theoretical works that we used were Helbeck's famous article, his first article on diaries and Soviet subjectivity, Budninsky's article on Jewish diary writers at the front, and Aleda Osman's article on testimony. And what's interesting about her is she is primarily interested in Holocaust memorialization and Holocaust memory and oral histories. And as those of you who work with Archive know, part of the idea of the Veterans Project was to look at a Jewish experience that was not the Holocaust experience, look at the Jewish experience that was, people actively fighting the Nazis and get that story out. So just to talk briefly about how this worked and who Komsky is. So Komsky is a fascinating individual in that he is, like many people in our various collections, someone who was a dedicated communist but had a critical eye. So if you read his diary, you'll often see, he goes from being a Komsomol member to a party candidate to a party member. He goes from being largely a frontline combat soldier to basically still being on the front line, but doing largely political work. And perhaps most importantly and interestingly for our students, he is a 20-something dude looking for love at the front. And he talks about his various romantic experiences. He talks about his disappointment in them. He talks about his disappointment in his fellow soldiers. He talks about the bravery of his fellow soldiers. He talks about all sorts of different things. And so, for that particular week in the course on genres of war, there's some interesting overlaps between Komsky in 1943 and Komsky in 2009. He still loves poetry. He still writes poetry. He can still recite poetry. Komsky in the 1940s is a young man looking for love. Chomsky in the 2000s is a older man looking back at his life, he doesn't end up marrying anybody who he's pursuing in the diary, and his wife eventually makes him get rid of the love letters. But he's a guy, looking back at and even tells some of the same stories, but in a different way, which is quite interesting. So, the students really loved that particular week. Some of them found it to be a particularly emotionally challenging week because it is a real person as opposed to much of the rest of the course was fictionalized experiences. And Chomsky was also used extensively in another course that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to spend the second half of my time talking about, which is my World War II, a cultural history course, a course that I've taught both at NYU and Sarah Lawrence. And the final project for that is I have a curated list of, at this point, about 25 personal narratives of the war. Students have to choose two. Chomsky is one of the options, and compare the experience of these two people who lived through the war. And they have a series of prompts. I'm happy to send this to you all if you're interested later. I give them a lot. I want a wide variety of papers, so I give them very open-ended prompts. Some students loved that. Some students hated that because it forced them to think for themselves. I give them way too many questions than they can possibly answer in a coherent paper, but just to get them thinking about, like, so what is it exactly that allowed this person to survive? Actually, not everybody survived. Some of the people whose options died during the war. What is it about their demographic information that impacts their lives? Why are they writing the book that they're writing? How is ideology impacting them? And so Chomsky is one of the options for that. And I want to turn to talk a little bit about some of the other weeks in that course and some of the other assignments because I draw on our holdings fairly extensively for this World War II course. So there is one week that is, let's see, a week that is about why soldiers fought. And in that particular week, there's a lot of Soviet propaganda. I don't give them much German propaganda that week because they've been so immersed in Nazi stuff before that they already kind of have a sense. And one of the sources that I use, one of the strangest and rarest sources that we have, is a series of sermons and addresses published by the Jewish Welfare Board in 1944 that are exemplary sermons by rabbis. And the one that I give them is Towards Eternal Peace by Chaplain Alexander D. Good, who becomes very famous as one of the 4 chaplains who goes down with this troop transport in February of 1943. And the interesting thing about this, it reads like a FDR campaign speech. There is almost nothing about God in this. It is almost entirely secular. And then some of the other sermons in this are super traditional, super normalized, like what you would hear in a shul today, drawing on the Old Testament, not really drawing on modern politics. And this kind of shows, and this is also important to my current book on chaplains that I'm writing, the wide variety of types of propaganda, the wide variety of what chaplains were allowed to talk about during the war. Now, probably on somewhat more familiar territory, one of the other weeks of that course is a week in which in which I give, basically accounts of what it's like to be a soldier in the Second World War. And in that, I have an excerpt from Mark Bloch's Strange Defeat, talking about what it was like to be in the French army getting destroyed in 1940. Karl Fuchs's Sieg Heil, which is a German tank officer in the invasion of Russia. Paul Fussel's My War, which is a very sardonic, very short thing about how much it sucked to be an American infantryman. And a curated list of 9 of the Consiticus letters. And the Consiticus letters are also one of our greatest holdings, as you know, like well over 600 letters between 1942 and 1945. One of the few cases where you have both both sides of the correspondence, both the soldier at the front and Elisheva at home. So I have this very curated list, and students found this to be one of the favorite things that they read during the semester, because much like Chomsky, Consiticus is a hardcore Stalinist, but he is also highly critical. And is also filled with personal longing, filled with all sorts of descriptions of what the Nazis are doing, all sorts of descriptions of how difficult it is to keep a child alive on the home front during the Second World War. So, in a relatively short amount of text, they get a wide prismatic view of the experience of Soviet people during the war, newly made Soviet people. These are people became Soviet citizens in 1940. And reading them alongside somebody who's ideologically on the other spectrum was something that they also found quite interesting. The last piece that I want to talk about from that course is on the week on the Holocaust. I give them a letter sent to Lev Fine by a family friend who happened to be pretty much the only survivor of his inner circle from Minsk, and her talking about how she survived by going underground, pretending not to be Jewish. And this combines just this sense of how difficult it was to be a survivor, themes of seeking vengeance, themes of just how people's social worlds were destroyed by the war, which, basically in about 4 pages gives you this whole microcosm of that experience. So I'm going to cut it short there. I actually have a bunch of questions about other people's presentations and don't want to take up too much time, but thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from Marina.
Brandon, thank you so much. Yeah, it's amazing to see some of these items that I know so well, but come alive and think about how they're coming alive in your classroom. So yeah, thank you. Marina, if you wouldn't mind introducing and your class and what you're doing. Oh, no, Marina, you are muted. If you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself.
Sure. Yes,
Hello.
here I am, and let me
Welcome.
share the screen. Everyone hears me well? Yes,
No,
everyone
we're just
hears
seeing
me well?
you. And Marina Aptekman, you're teaching at Tufts University, right?
Oh, yeah, I'll tell everything in a minute, and I'll do
Okay.
myself louder. Do you see and hear me well?
We see you and hear you.
Perfect. Okay, great. So I will share the screen, and I hope you will see the presentation as well. Do you see the presentation?
There, yes.
Perfect. Okay, so because I want to keep short, and unfortunately being short is a huge issue when I talk. So I'll try myself to be as short as possible. And I will concentrate primarily on the course that I've been teaching in spring 2024 when I received the grant from Blavatnik Archive. However, at the end, I will also briefly talk about 2 other courses that I have been teaching last academic year and how I incorporated Blavatnik materials into these 2 courses as well. The course that I primarily will concentrate on is called Jewish Voices in Russian Culture. I kind of don't like the title, and I think that Tufts should change it because it's really not really Jewish Voices in Russian Culture, because when we think about Russian culture, we speak about Russian language and works in the Russian language, but it's more like Russian Jewish experience in culture, literature, and film, where we speak about the history of Russian Jews, not through history, but through culture, through film, media, theater, music. Basically, the course is cultural course. However, after I finished teaching this course last year, I've been also teaching Introduction to Russian Culture in the totally new course, which is called Mapping Israeli Society, Cultures and Communities of Modern Israel. And I've been using the archive materials as well, and I'll show you briefly how. So I will start. So basically, what happened? Implementation overview. The students mostly explored. It's also important that I learned about the archive basically a month before I started the course, and I received the grant with full access to the archive only in March. So I mostly at that time didn't use the materials in my lectures, but in the student projects where they had to work independently. And my format, as you see, was pretty similar to what other people already spoke. So it's interesting that we kind of all thought in the same direction. Students explored collections mostly semi-independently with guidance, and they had individual meetings to refine the idea and select archive materials. Next year, when I used the same format, I did it exactly as the first speaker spoke about, that there were 10 images, for example, and they had to choose between these two images, because firstly, how I did it, the students themselves had to go through the archive, because I was thinking, okay, they would look for something that interests them the most in the collections. When I gave them the topic, for example, you see in a minute what I mean. But through this topic, they had to choose by themselves. It was, as students mentioned in the evaluations, a little bit overwhelming, and some were kind of confused. So then I limited it to particular numbers of images. There were 24/7 people in the course, and just if anyone interested, just to give you the understanding what we were reading the Dairyman, we were reading Hard Judgment by Bergelson, 5H Jabotinsky, Odessa Stories and Red Cavalry by Babel, just half of the book Zalmaniners by Kulbeck, just short pieces from Soviet and Kosher, and then Sonemet Boris by Anna Sternschis, and also some chapters from Through Soviet Jewish Eyes by David Schneier. We watched Fiddler on the Roof, Commissar, Seeking of Happiness, and Sobibor. I very much wanted to see, to make them see Pravednik instead of Sobibor, but it didn't work out because it doesn't have subtitles. So, the focus was on pre-revolutionary Jewish life and early Soviet identity. And later we spoke about late Soviet identity and immigration. The mid-term project, which was the main project where I used the archive, excluded Second World War, excluded post-war, and excluded Holocaust. And mostly what students concentrated were 3 different collections: Bund propaganda, the postcards that spoke about the 1920s and the First World War, and primarily, and that's what the students chose most, they really liked it, was the collection of corset designs. And here I'll give one example how students did it. And this was a few papers, quite a lot of people wrote the papers on this, and that was pretty exciting. So I learned, I didn't know that before Blavatnik Archive, that the recently translated by Senderovich, a novel, The Hard Judgment by David Bergelson, was performed in early 1930s, I think 1931 or 1932, I really don't remember, to tell you honestly, in Moscow Gossip. And what we have, and here is the example, like if anyone is unfamiliar with novel, it's one of Bergelson's most innovative and experimental works, both stylistically and thematically, and it actually traces the establishment of Bolshevik power in a place where people, goods, and counter-revolutionary literature are smuggled across the border. Gossip adaptation very much concentrated on the idea of the death of Schechter, which also spoke about, when we spoke about David the Dairyman, how the progressive liberal Russian and later Soviet Jewish thought regarded Shtetl very much not as a place of nostalgia, but place of decay, and how Jews should turn towards Russification. What I found in the archive, what was very interesting, were images of designs which were done by Meir Axelrod, and also some sketches of early Gossip by Chagall. So what we spoke about, because we spoke about Chagall designs for Gossip in the 1920s. We spoke about relations between Axelrod art and influence of Chagall on Axelrod. We also spoke about the connection between Michoels and Meyerhold. And the students had to explore the collection of Gossip archives. Some of them decided to look at the designs, and they compared designs by Meyerhold with designs by Axelrod that they found in the archive. For example, if you see here, this is not from the archive. This is the image that one of the students found online from Meyerhold Productions. And this is how Axelrod depicted Shtetl. And if you can see, it's actually very similar So that's what they like mostly discussed. It also was interesting that we discussed how in shtetls, by contrast with what Fiddler on the Roof shows, where Christians and Jews are completely separate from each other and meet only during the pogroms. On Chagall's pictures, we can see that cross and the church is very much on the middle of the shtetl painting. And here, one of the students pointed it, you can see exactly the same thing in Axelrod designs for the stage adaptation. So that was really interesting how they deeply analyzed the materials. And again, of course, now probably you can give it to AI and say, like, analyze it yourself. But most of the students were very excited that they can do it by themselves. And they spoke about it and they found like different details and we discussed it with them and they were pretty excited. So here are some highlights that students did in this midterm projects. As I said, Meir Axelrod designed for Bergilson Midas Hadim. There was very interesting analysis of Soviet anti-religious posters, Jewish and not Jewish, and how similar or different they are. And one of the students did extremely interesting thing. Actually, I used it later when I did the course on Israeli culture. But the beginning of it was a student who did it in this particular course that was Zionist versus Soviet poster aesthetics, because early Zionist aesthetics are very similar to Soviet poster aesthetics. And the students went through the collection of Soviet posters and found online Zionist posters at the same time and compared that. And also because in that year, we spoke about Fiddler on the Roof, again, some students looked through the collection of postcards and they spoke about American versus Soviet shtetl representation. And that was like really, really interesting. So, and this is actually, that's what I like very much. And if I might show it, that's a student used, for the collection of posters. This is like the Yiddish poster from 1920s. No, sorry, this is, the Yiddish posters from 1920s. This is the Soviet poster. And this is actually, Hebrew poster, which is funny. So now we come to the later period, and that was the final project overview. And the final project concentrated on the testimonies of war veterans, because by that I wanted to connect the period of the war with actually a current immigration of Jews to Israel and to United States, because actually when we spoke about Anna Sternsch's book, a lot of narratives by Anna Sternsch's are actually taken from elderly Jews who live in the United States or Israel. And it was very interesting to look at these testimonies and compare them with oral narratives in Anna Sternsch's. So that's exactly what they had to do. They analyzed Soviet Jewish veterans' interview. They had to pick their own interview. They selected 3-4 interviews and also some photos and some letters. They connected testimonies to Second World War and also to their immigration studies. And they spoke about wartime heroism and how a lot of interviews actually spoke about post-war marginalization. And that's also what Sternsch's write about. And here is a very interesting example. I'll read it aloud, but you can take time and also read it on the screen. That's basically a quote from a student paper. The testimonies from the Blavatnik Archive provide powerful first-hand accounts of Soviet Jewish veterans' experience during and after World War II. These narratives, when examined alongside literary works and historical scholarship, reveal the complex and often contradictory position of Jews within the Soviet society. And I don't want to read the whole thing to take time, just go through. But what for me was very interesting, if we go to the very, very, very end, it's interesting that one of the students combines one of the interviews, that he decided to analyze with the film Sebebor. And what, the interview was by Manevich. And what he does, he says, he combines it with Alexander Pechersky from Sebebor. And he says, both Manevich and Pechersky navigated their dual identities under extreme duress, using cunning and resolve to survive, using cunning, I don't know, but it's in resolve to survive system. I think I missed here something. To survive system designed for their destruction. This dual identity burden is powerfully articulated in Boris Slutsky's poem about the Jews, where he writes, "Your Jews cunning bastards. He is not much good in any army. Ivan is entrenched in doing battle, and Abram doing train in the market. Slutsky captivates the painful stereotypes Jewish soldiers confronted while fighting and dying for the Soviet cause." And he basically combines the interview with Slutsky poem with Pechersky experiences and writes the whole paper on it. So these are the student examples. What they did, they compared analysis of multiple testimonies, intersection of oral history and songs from Anders Sternsch's project Yiddish Gloria, where they paralleled interviews with the songs and the history of the songs, comparison with personal family interviews, because some of the students were from Russian-speaking heritage families. So they compared the interviews they took from their own grandfathers with the interviews in the archive, and also comparison with oral narratives in Sonia Medvoris by Anders Sternsch's. I don't want, like, how many minutes? I think I need to finish. How much time do I have? I have like 3-4 slides left. Do I have enough time? I don't hear you. Natalia, I don't hear you. You're on mute.
It's so interesting. Please do continue.
Are you sure? Okay,
Yes,
if it's
please.
too much, let me know. So one of the things, again, which was like really interesting, and this was so interesting that we spoke about it in class, not just students wrote about it. I don't know if anyone knows, there is an absolutely fascinating book by David Schneier, which is called Through Soviet Jewish Eyes, Photography of War and Holocaust, which actually speaks about the fact that mostly which is pretty fascinating, Soviet war photographer during the Second World War was actually Jewish. And when we looked, and we read chapters from this book, because these were the people who were like, who narrated the story of ghettos when they liberated the ghettos, and Holocaust and concentration camps and death camps and also the siege. So Boris Kudayarov's photography was a very good example of what Schneier was doing in his book. So we discussed it in class. We looked at the picture from Kudayarov's collection, and we discussed it in the light of what the students read through in the Soviet Jewish eyes. And that was like really, really interesting discussion, because it gave students like completely new insight. So now to the end, student feedback. Student feedback honestly was mixed. Some people were very happy about everything. Some people were confused because it looked different from traditional paper. And now, when you can actually do traditional paper through AI, some of the students were not happy that they had to do like real archival research. Some were extremely happy. They enjoyed autonomy. They very much enjoyed research depth. But some found volume overwhelming. So now what I'm doing, and what I did in other 2 classes, I selected myself the images. It's a little bit hard to access them on the archive, because it's hard to create the folder and let the students access them. So I just copied them and put them on Canvas. And they used these images, and they were picking, out of it like 10 images rather than do their own research work themselves. And they requested clear structure. So that's why now I have much more clear structure. So when I used things in the introduction to Russian culture and in the Israeli course, students were much more helpful, much more happier, because they found the clear structure much more helpful. And these were thematic folders created on Canvas. Also, some visuals are integrated into lectures, just as I said with Meir Axelrod. And it was more like, next time I'm going to teach this course now in spring again. So what I'll do, rather than do like 2 big projects, I'll rather do small projects, like structured ones. When we speak about VOSIT, I will give them a short structured assignment. Do a short assignment on the archive only on VOSIT. Then same thing. You read Schneier. We spoke about Schneier, looked at the Kudayarov's images, do just a short assignment comparing the 2. And same thing we did with propaganda posters. It's much easier than it's more short projects rather than one large project, because then they come to large project, they already prepared. And also this time I will do special extra project for Russian-speaking students, because they can interview their own grandfathers or grandmothers in Russian, and if they want, they can even write in Russian and get extra credit. The very last piece of the puzzle that I'll speak very, very briefly, I will say just 2 sentences about how I used it in Introduction to Russian Culture, because that's already had been said. We spoke about siege, and we spoke about the documentation of the siege, and that was really, really interesting, because just as in the previous lecture, we compared it with Bergold's, but we also compared it with a book by Polina Varskova, which has aesthetic representation of the siege, and that was very interesting because the photograph is in a way aesthetic representation, but it's also a document. So we discussed how documenting and artistic part are combined in these two things. And the last thing that I will just say 2 sentences, it's how I used the materials in the Israeli course, and that's where I exactly concentrated on one paper that a student wrote about the correspondence of posters, and we spoke about the similarity of images in Hebrew culture in Israel, socialist Hebrew culture in Israel, and in Bund later, Yevsevtsi later, Birobidzhan propaganda in Yiddish. We showed how parallel they actually are, and they showed to students the film Avada, which is the very earliest, very socialist movie created in 1935, and we compared it with Soviet socialist realism and with pictures from Blavatnik Archive. So that was like really stimulating, and the students really liked it. So to summarize, I want more to continue expansion into all culture courses, just as I said, including introduction to Russian culture and cultures and communities of modern Israel. I also want to use assignments of women's role in Soviet propaganda. I used early Zionism pressed materials in the culture of communities in modern Israel. And I want to create shorter home projects, which will be more like homework, which will be shorter projects concentrating on particular topics. That's mostly it. I believe that Blavatnik Archive proved an extremely powerful educational tool that increased engagement, creativity, and most important, originality. Connected history with primary sources. It allowed students more and more understand their own, like grandfathers, for example, if they were, Russian speaking. It allowed advanced student research, but on the other hand, it also created issues, because if the student doesn't want archival research, but just want to skip through the course and use AI, these people are not very happy. But I try to do this. That's mostly it. Sorry for being long.
Marina, absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for presenting. I will just say before the conversation, as you all know, we started the archive about 21 years ago, and the idea was first to just preserve things that we thought were really unique and interesting, and then it was to provide access to the scholars to work with it. And the dream was, of course, eventually, like, how can this be used in the classroom, knowing that we're not in the classroom? And so I can't tell you how meaningful it is to hear what everything that you've talked about and how it is actually being used. So sort of the imagination of 21 years ago, to hear that is really special. I'm going to just, open it, but, and then I will have also questions. Yes, Marina.
I just want very quickly, and again, that will be the last thing that I'm
No.
speaking a lot. But I want to share it with somebody, because I was thinking about Blavatnik Archive like yesterday, and I want to share this story. I was thinking to share it, not to share it. I want to share it, and how important archive is. My son is preparing for SAT, and he has a lot of books for SAT, and I needed to place these books somewhere, and we didn't have place in his room, so I went to the basement where my mother lived before she moved to nursing facility, and I started looking at the shelves to put these books, and there was some kind of plastic bag there, and I needed to remove it. So I removed the plastic bag. Out of curiosity, I looked what is in this plastic bag, and I found letters that my great-grandfather, Nea Feigenberg, part of Congetics family, wrote to my great-grandmother. And I also found the letter that I actually don't know even who wrote it, and my mother doesn't remember, which says like, "Dear so-and-so, I'm sorry to write to you, but I'm afraid to write to the parents of this boy, because I don't know them. I don't want to overstress them too much. But can you please share with me any news if this boy indeed died in the front? I don't believe he did, because I know so well him for so many years. He was always find the way out. I don't believe that he's dead. Can you please share with me any news about him?" And I went to my mother. I brought this letter. I spoke with her, and suddenly she remembered. which, you know, she doesn't remember a lot of things, but no, that's Nolik. I know, he died under Leningrad in 1941. And I look at this piece of paper, which is like extremely, extremely fragile, you know, and was in the basement for like, I don't know, probably 5, 6, 7 years. And I said, oh, you know what? I need to write to Natalia. I need to write to Blavatnik Archive. We need to digitize it. We need to preserve it. These things should stay forever. So I think this is what the archive is for. Sorry for sharing.
Marina, thank you so much. And yeah, Steve and Sam, the other piece that I will share is Marina is actually directly related to the whole Kontsevika's family, I believe, right? Collection and story is part of her family, which we did not realize until we met. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, I know questions wanted to open up, and then if at all possible, I would love to leave the last few minutes also for, you know, how can we be more helpful? Marina, you already mentioned the folders. I've seen some of the things that you're showing, like maps, things like that. Maybe in the end, you know, we're always trying to think about what is it that we can do to sort of help. But yeah, just opening it up for any conversation. Okay, no one has anything.
Oh, I have a question.
Jenny, hi.
Hi. I mean, I work primarily with younger, like high school students, and so maybe this is something that's not as relevant in the college classroom. But I was wondering how you field or deal with or, you know, preface sort of the emotional element of working with these sources. I mean, they are so evocative and can be really, you know, explicit and detailed, and, you know, especially for students with heritage in and their own personal stories. It's just something that I'm sort of conscious of before I plan to use any of these things. So I was just curious how any of you deal with that.
I'll go. I have one large trigger warning at the beginning of every course I teach, because I teach primarily courses on violence, world wars, Soviet history. So I do it once, and I'm very explicit about kind of two things that I do. One, warning students out who are not going to be comfortable taking such a course, and two, really trying to be very explicit about the relationship between ideology and what happens and violence, as a way to kind of think about like, okay, well, there is this terrible thing that happens, but it's not random, it's not cancer, right? It is, people did this. How do we explain that people did this in a sense, in a way that allows us to make sense of the fact that like someone did this and then went home and played with their kids, and that people will probably do something like this again, and how to kind of know the signs of that.
I say something similarly at the beginning of my World Wars class that I mentioned, because the whole class is a study in these issues as well. And then especially when we get closer to the Second World War and some of the horrific photographs taken on the Eastern Front, I bring up the issue of why we look at these photographs. Schneer, I think in his book, The Biography of Grief, the photo, has a really good section about how to look at these photographs and why we should look at these photographs that I usually cite from when I get to that point in the class, to help prepare students. But the focus throughout the class, and what I underscore when I give the trigger warning is sort of what Brandon just said. That is that these are people, they are individuals, they lived lives. We shouldn't just look at them only through this frozen moment of horror, but understand they lived an entire life up until that point. I think that helps actually.
And also, you know, speaking about high school, if I might say, teaches, oh, here I'm going to be critical of United States. It teaches students about something that they never learned in high school. because when they concentrate on Second World War, they always concentrate on violence through tragedy, you know, violence as murder. But that kind of completely excludes the Soviet experience, which is the experience of heroism, much more than violence, you know, which is the experience of Soviet Jews, I don't know, fighting under Stalingrad, taking Berlin, and where the Jew suddenly stops being victim of violence, but becomes actually the force that does everything to stop the violence. Yes, through the violence, but stop the violence. And when they read about it in articles, they think about it more as an abstract thing. When they go through the interviews, it becomes much, much more personal. And the students learn things about Second World War they never learned before. For many of them, it becomes a revelation.
That's a really great point, Marina. And I've also noticed that in the essays that my students have written and the comments that they've made, that this totally opens up a different understanding of the Second World War for them. They often emphasize the heroism of the veterans that they access through their testimonies. Absolutely. I'm just thinking of a couple examples. Often students choose to write about some of the women veterans, many of whom have experience in nursing or in field hospitals, even when they themselves have been injured and wounded. And many students have written about the sort of heroism of these women taking care of other soldiers as an example of exactly what you're talking about. I mean, to your question, Jenny, I also give a sort of warning at the beginning of the course about the material that's going to be discussed. And I also do, when bringing in the veterans' testimonies, give again a kind of, I wouldn't really call it a trigger warning, but an indication that this material might be disturbing, but also emotionally weighty for many of them. And I find that even after that, in the lectures where I present those testimonies and talk about other things as well, students will be moved and will weep and things even in response to them. But another thing that I do in dealing with these collections is I try to engage with them, to interrogate them as well with the students. So I also introduce the possibility, okay, sort of basic memory studies things, basic ideas about working with personal recollections. What is being left out here? What is being distorted here? What, for example, in the dairy factory sour cream clip, at the end of that clip, it's supposed to be funny, but it's not actually funny, where a helmet full of sour cream is hit by a shell and it douses everyone in sour cream. And I sort of asked them, well, what might be behind that image, or what might be really being described there? And so we can interrogate, I think, the ways in which these traumatic experiences are being presented in these materials as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you all. And I want to thank you also just for your presentations in general. Thank you.
Just the question about high school students, and I think it's part of also, I was wondering, for any of these classes that you've introduced, are there prerequisites? Did they have, or do they come with any body of knowledge that's relevant? I understand they picked the class, but how much of that preparation is there? And then I just wanted to mention, we are starting to do more work with what is it for high school teachers. We're doing a fellowship program with the Harvard David Center outreach program, K through 14. The topic is propaganda, and then the selected sort of fellows at the end create this curricula that they can use for these different sort of classes. All of that to say, sort of what knowledge needs to be in place, what sort of experience can be without that knowledge. And I was wondering, just an idea that sprang up as one of the assignments, could it be in an undergraduate classroom, Steve, sort of combining your 3-minute, 5-minute presentation is selected to teach what would this undergraduate student use this sort of visual piece or any kind of text piece to teach someone in high school? What would they tell a high school student? And I think it'd be kind of interesting to, yeah, see what would come up.
You want me to answer that now? I see Henry has his hand up, but I can answer that. So that's a great question, Julian. It's something I want to work on. We have a pretty strong social studies secondary education program here at Miami, and I get a fair number of students in any class I teach that are fulfilling requirements for that major. They're often the best 3-minute presentation givers in the class, I think, because of that. But I do think actually I just wrote a note to myself. That's something, given this subset of students and the demand for good high school teaching, that's something I need to embed in my class a lot more. I will say, to Marina's point, I'm actually, as a former American high school student who didn't even get to World War II when I was in my high school in the 80s, and I've had 2 sons go through high school history. I'm actually somewhat grateful for the lack of depth in American high school history classes, because that's what I build on. Students come in knowing a few things about World War II, and it's usually from the perspective of American soldiers, maybe a family member, Pearl Harbor and all that. They now get to, they don't know really much about the Eastern Front. I think it would be hard to work it into a high school history class. So that's something that always astounds them, is learning about this other entire front of World War II, not to mention the entire front of World War I.
Henry, you wanted to say something?
Oh, thank you. It was just sort of a mixed comment about the emotional impact of this stuff. I should say I'm a PhD candidate, so I don't do a great deal of teaching, but I was involved in one undergraduate student's summer project in which he wanted to look at visual depictions of women in the Soviet Union during and then after the war. And I did really struggle to she was very quick to brush off any potential impact of working with this material. And the Blavatnik Archive was on there, but she also would, I expect, have ended up looking at material relating to Zoya Kosmodeonskaya, which is also really quite graphic in nature. And I think what quite surprised me was how swift she was to dismiss any potential impact on herself. I think, as someone who had no direct connection to this, who had no expectation of this, and I think this project in the end never went ahead, but what I'd begun to try and think about is, how do you design a support system for someone who doesn't think they need it, in the belief that at some point that's probably going to become relevant? And I don't know if that's something you guys have had experience in.
I'll take a stab at that too, I guess. It's also a way of further answering Jenny's initial question. And it's just simply drawing on the experience of teaching the World Wars class. So I have, every time I've taught it, but particularly this last spring, focused a lot on diaries and writing and the experience of writing and communication, because that's a function, I think, of the World Wars that makes those wars a more literate experience and gives us, therefore, more sources. And I have begun every time I've started this class, the first day, I use the example of my grandfather's diary from World War II. It's the one possession I have of his. He died when I was 7. He was only 57 years old. But I learned about World War II sort of from him. And over time, I've realized that every combatant country in the world wars gave soldiers diaries. Even the Russian Empire in World War I gave soldiers diaries. And I make that part of the story along the way. And this time, this is thinking about AI and learning and other things. I actually gave every student, I probably have one here behind me, but now I don't when I need it most, a kind of moleskin-like notebook at the beginning of class, and had them take their notes for the class, made quizzes, open notebook, but also encourage them they do 2 research projects too, to examine their own family histories and find out things about their now great-grandfathers, great-grandmothers, and great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers. So it helps them learn empathy and the individual stories within these sources that they get to in looking at the Eastern Front in World War II. And I think that actually had the benefit of, when we do get to those horrific images like Zoya's, they understand this is someone their age, someone the age of their great grandparents that they've learned about. I've actually had students find some extraordinary things. I had a member of the Miami Nation, were named after this Native American tribe, discover that her great-grandfather was one of only 1,000 Native Americans that saw combat in World War I, and then found out that her grandfather was a code talker in World War II and knew nothing about these things before this project. So there it is. Like, learning those stories helps you understand your own stories, and connecting them helps you understand others.